Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Crave Connection in Product podcast. This episode comes from our recent meetup on leading through the chaos, those moments in product leadership where things are fast, messy, and uncertain. We had some really brilliant questions and reflections from the community, so we've brought together our speakers, some of our speakers, to unpack it all, from decision-making with imperfect data, to managing upwards, to finding focus when everything's moving at once. One of the biggest tensions that we discussed on the evening was around decision-making. When you don't have perfect data, knowing when to move fast and when to pause. Sara, at the meetup, you shared 3 ingredients for making great roadmap calls. Can you share your top 3 tips with us on how you prioritize and make decisions?
I will delve into my memory and do my best. Okay, so 3 ingredients, if we phrase it like that. In the mixing bowl, we will throw in making decisions when we're thinking about road mapping. First, start off with the right people in the room. That's quite a small group of people that each have enough kind of seniority to make decisions, but it's cross-functional because otherwise you're going to keep whirring around. So first ingredient in that bowl is a small group of relatively senior cross-functional people. Second one is just start the conversation with what do we think are the biggest things that are going to make an impact, like depending on how short or near term you need that impact to be. So start almost top down rather than bottoms up. And then my third, I think, ingredient was don't get distracted by over-engineering scoring, which I think some people feel okay about and some people feel less okay about. But I personally think when you're in a smaller scaling business, if you have to justify something loads and loads by giving it a scoring and a weighting and a blah, 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 you're probably not all in the same place as a leadership group over what you're trying to do. So yeah, right small group of people in the room, focus on what will make the biggest impact top down. And then third, don't get distracted by having to over justify using frameworks.
Nice. Does anyone have anything else to add into that or any observations on what Zara said there?
I have one. I think once you go a layer down from there and you're having kind of very proactive discussions about what we're going to be delivering or what will be delivered in the upcoming period of time, I think it's really important for decision makers and people who are kind of making those calls to actually understand what the trade-offs look like and being able to adequately communicate those. I think I've seen it work well where you can really clearly say, right, if we want to do X, we won't be able to do Y. I think where oftentimes you see people stumble is where they can't adequately provide a trade-off because it doesn't feel like there's much of a decision to make. Then it just feels like an obvious call. Whereas I think if you're being explicit in what you're trading off, I think it does make people take a step back and say, right, okay, is this definitely the right thing to be doing and moving forward within the roadmap?
Yeah, I think also if it's particularly on new products or new initiatives, and potentially you have a vision of where you think a product might be in 1 year's time, and you're looking now, right, what do we need to prove now? Making sure that everyone is aligned as to what the biggest risks are in that vision and that new initiative, and then saying, okay, these are all of the different risks, and they could be across a value, a viability, feasibility, and then saying, right, we're going to focus on de-risking the biggest risk first, to make sure that we can be aligned on whether we need to course correct, whether this initiative or new product and idea is actually even feasible as well.
But maybe just one thing would be that in my experience, it's also when you come to these cross-functional conversations, a lot of the times opinions would surface that may be different. I think it is absolutely okay. I don't think it's necessary to even reach consensus in these sessions. But from a product standpoint, what I think is super important is to come to these sessions, A, with an open mind, but 2, also, if you want to say no to something, you need to be able to say yes to something else and justify it. Because quite often, I think Lisette is smiling because we talk about it in the team a lot, but I think quite often what I see is that people think that something is a bad idea for potentially a very good reason. And they come into these sessions with a very strong pushback of no, this is the wrong thing to do. Here are all the reasons why. But actually, I don't think that's hugely helpful, especially when you have senior people or senior cross-functional team in the room. A much more helpful approach to say, okay, this is interesting, but actually, have we thought about doing that instead? Because this is what we're going to be getting if we do this versus what we're going to be getting if we do that. I think positioning the trade-off in this way is more impactful and actually easier to walk out of that room with a confidence than just blindly pushing back, which I think for product common, but not very helpful.
It's less confident.
I'm not build on that. I really like the way that you phrase that, Maria. I think that point about open mind, like don't go in being like, I'm going to win this idea and it's going to get on the roadmap. Because then you end up in quite a defensive or potentially not aggressive, but kind of pushy, you versus me discussion. If you do go in with like, I think these are the best things, I'm pretty confident about them, I've got the evidence, I'm going to listen first and understand in that kind of classic, whatever, leading strategy kind of background reading I've been doing recently. It really helps the process of discussion of like not going in with a I'm going to win mindset, but I'm going to have an open mind and listen and understand. I think that's a really good kind of skill to build.
It's slightly less confrontational in that way then, isn't it? And I think it goes back to a couple of different things. So that's something that really stuck in my mind that you discussed at the meetup was around like seeing things from other people's perspective, and that like analogy of the apples on the table, that there's 5 apples but they can see 6, like that kind of thing of putting yourself in other people's shoes. And also, if we're looking at those ingredients which you first put into this, Sara, is the if you've got the right people in the room, there should be people who you kind of generally like value their opinions, they have good input. So I think that that's a really good point. Maria, you've led through a lot of fast-paced product decisions at scale. So what do you think stops teams from trusting their judgment when data is messy or incomplete? And how do you create culture which creates a space where, that is possible to use kind of that more product sense and to empower people to do that?
Yeah, great question. I think it's probably like the hardest one to nail. And I don't think there is a universal answer. I think it really depends on the environment, the company, like what kind of decision we're talking about. I would say from my perspective, what's very important is clarity. Give the teams clarity on the context, like what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? What's the context behind it? Make it, I think, clear what's the boundary of empowerment, so to speak? Because I think also in early stage, there are instances where, I don't know, let's say you're iterating on the business model or you are in a very challenging trading position. And it's a situation where probably, your CEO, your founder, or the senior team are going to be very involved for a good reason, right? Because it's kind of existential to the business. So it's very core to the business proposition. And I think in these instances, it would be silly to say, well, we're going to build a fully empowered product team that make all the decisions and then they just present them to leadership, right? Like it's just not the right way to do it. So I think it's important to set context with the teams within that, like, what are we here for? What is the extent of that freedom that we have right now and why? And be transparent. That's one. 2, I would say, really, really important to continue working, if you're a senior member of the team, to continue working with the other peers in the group, offline, so to speak, or to do it privately. Because it's also important that they understand what is the role of the product team, how does it come together, where is the value add. And third thing and last thing is, I would say also, you can never show the value of something by speaking. You can only show it by doing. So it's also carving out the time to actually, when you think about the value out of the product team, right? A lot of the time it's bringing the voice of the customer. A lot of the time it's bringing data to the table. A lot of the time it's building a strong customer intuition to the table. So how can you, in the chaos of early stage, how can you earmark some time for the team to be able to do this, even if it's at a small scale, just so then you can demonstrate to others, like, actually, look, here's what we've done. This is why it's valuable. See, and actually get them to feel the value of it, as opposed to just sitting there and saying, like, we need to do more customer research. Unless we do more customer research, we're not going to be able to know what to do. And it's quite challenging, right? And I think it's like being transparent. I don't think, for example, I've fully nailed it. I can think of instances where probably like I could have done better, or we as a team could have done better. Because especially when you try to move fast, especially I think in the challenging pivotal moments for the business, it's hard to do. But I think just coming back to it periodically and reminding the teams that this is what we're here to do, this is our boundary, this is what our value it is super important.
One thing that stood out to me, which Laura actually mentioned.
Is it just me, or do you have really?
I wondered if it stopped now.
I think it's Maria's mic feeds back.
I was going to say, I wondered if it was just me and it was playing through, but that's fine. We're back now. Cool. So I think it's just Maria. I think you're going to have to mute yourself when you're not speaking. Cool. So one thing that Laura mentioned, obviously she's not with us today, but she mentioned how I suppose there's that balance between using data as a crutch and really people thinking that that's the silver bullet that's going to solve everything, but also, relying on your product sense, but also, I suppose, holding yourself accountable to if you are being biased within that as well. And if you do already have a real conviction in what you think is right. I think that's a really difficult balance to find there. Does anyone have any advice on, I suppose, being ways which you make yourself aware of like that bias and how you could also like hold yourself accountable and how you determine the balance between like product sense and like just really strong conviction in knowing that, knowing if that's a bias or not?
I think Sara and Maria both touched on it earlier, and it can be difficult sometimes because you want to go in with all the answers that you possibly can have, with all the data that you can possibly have. Sometimes that's quite off-putting for stakeholders. So I think trying not to speak for the first part of the meeting, especially if it's kind of a brainstorming, because I think there's an element of potentially leading the witness. And if you're going in with a lot of biases and assumptions, it feels uncomfortable to sit there sometimes and listen to things that maybe have been tested before or things that maybe haven't worked in other companies. So I think it's important to just sit with that discomfort and listen. I think it can. I find this really challenging sometimes because I want to give the information that I have, or the learnings, insight I have, but I don't think that's necessarily valuable because in all instances, because people do want to feel like they're being listened to. So I think the bias that you have, you need to kind of check that at the door a little bit. It almost doesn't matter in some cases, in some meetings, that you have experience on things. I think it's just about listening to people, because I think in some cases there are definitely experts that you should be leaning into within your company, within your industry. And if you aren't open to hearing those ideas, then you're not going to learn anything new. You're just going to be repeating the same things over and over. So I think just check it at the door. So if you're going into a big meeting and just trying to be quiet and listen.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think also trying to question like where your intuition or product sense is coming from. And there's a difference between a product sense that is just purely gut driven, which is likely tons of bias, or a product sense that is built up from understanding your customer really deeply, looking at all of the data, looking at past experiments, and that kind of product sense is maybe hopefully less biased and hopefully more useful, and being really honest about whether your intuition is from, I don't know, almost like bravado, or from actually really from a real understanding of your product is quite different. And I think just being really honest and open with yourself about that is really important.
At the meetup, we, I suppose, talked about how chaos isn't just about like products and building products. It's about people, especially when you're managing upwards or influencing founders and execs who can crave like certainty, have like a very specific vision. So Dominic, I'm coming to you on this as our founder in the podcast. And so you talked about like picking your battles and understanding the why behind founders' decision. And I suppose that balance between like gut genius or a deep intuition. And I think you mentioned that, hopefully if you're working at those early stages with a founder, you really do believe that they're a market expert or they have that kind of genius within. So how do you decide when to challenge versus like when to execute fast, learn and show?
Yeah, it's really important. And there's definitely, and particularly as a founder, you definitely do get it wrong. So I think it all does come down to the type of decision it is, how big or how small it is. And also, I think we discussed, spoke about this a lot at the meetup, but whether this is a reversible or not reversible decision, and whether it's like a one-way or two-way door is another way of putting it. But also like how strong your perspective is to combining kind of all of those pieces. If you have a really strong data and you've got research that the founder maybe hasn't seen, then clearly that could well be worth fighting more for. So I do think it's your role to understand, like, is this gut genius? Is this kind of a pet project? How big or small is it? Is this something that if it is big and you have a good perspective on it and you disagree with the founder, then make sure that you are bringing data that can support your hypothesis, insights that you have, try to create a narrative around it. But if it's smaller and maybe neither of you have much data or insights that you can share, then I think a lot of the time it's about executing super quickly on this to really prove direction. And I think that's where your role shifts maybe from more strategic discovery side to the executor as well, which is also such an important part of early stage product.
Lisette, you mentioned, and we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but it really stood out to me around your apples scenario. So you mentioned like perception versus like reality, and that people have emotions that are driven by their perception. I think what stood out to me is that you can, your frustration, you could show that, and I think everyone could relate to that. That when you see something so clearly, it is frustrating if I suppose someone has a different perception to you. Obviously, it's important to make sure the teams feel supported, feel valued and bought in. So it's important to have other people's perspectives as we've discussed in this podcast. But do you have any tips on practical tips on how you've managed that and how you navigate that frustration?
Yeah, I think the frustration stems from a little bit of almost feeling like you're losing the plot a little bit. And I think I'll repeat the analogy for people who weren't there. But if I can see if there are visually 5 apples on the table to me, and someone says to me there are 6 apples on the table, their perception is their reality. So it doesn't really matter how many apples are on the table at that point. If their view is that there's 5 and -5 and there's a 6, you can't really overcome that kind of mentality. And I think it's important to not try to in some cases, because this frustration is inevitable in any role, in any industry. I've had a really similar journey in the last, let's say, week. I had a really frustrating conversation with someone. We agreed on all the requirements, everything was fine. And then, 20 minutes later, we're having to rework. So like that frustration sometimes is inevitable. And I think the most practical piece of advice I can give, and this is something that I say doesn't just apply to product, it applies to any kind of situation, which is take a breath, go outside if you can. If you can't, if it doesn't need an immediate reply, wait until the morning. Wait till tomorrow to send that reply. I think in the example where I think it was about a week ago, I was really frustrated by something. It was the end of the day and I thought, actually, this is there's no benefit for me replying right now. I'm going to sleep on it and I'm going to come back tomorrow with a fresh mindset. We had a catch up in person rather than it being, via Slack or via email. And I think a couple of those things combined, which is like discuss it in person, because I think a lot of context can get missed. And the second thing is take a breather on it and don't reply immediately if you feel frustrated or irritated by something. Admittedly, that's harder to do in a meeting, but I think a lot of work is done async nowadays, especially as more people are remote. So I think trying to speak to them face to face and then also making sure that you are not replying immediately. I think that allows a little bit of time to humanize it and really make sure that you're not just looking at this from a self-interested point of view, because it's frustrating to you. Try and understand like what's led to this, how you could potentially help them with this. And if you are ever brusque in a meeting, or you're ever sort of like a bit blunt with someone at a later point or the next day or later on that day, just explaining the frustration and be like, hey, sorry if it's a bit short in that meeting. This is where it stems from. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware. It might be there's lots of other conversations that are happening on the side as well. And the last thing is 80% of the time, the intent is good. So try and assume good intent. There are very rare occasions where there are people who try and undermine productivity at work and will make kind of back channel agreements. That is not the majority of cases. So I would say assume good intent is the last thing I'd say. So explain yourself, assume good intent, and wait to reply.
I just want to add something to what Lisette said. I think also another point to that list of things, and probably I would put it first, is to be very clear what you disagree on. So to using the example that you shared, like 5 apples versus 6, I think it's really important to then be like, okay, hey, like, let's just be clear. I feel like we're not aligned. Are we not aligned on how many apples are on the table? Or is it something else? Because quite often what I've seen, especially when you observe other people being in that conversation, is actually maybe one person is frustrated with the speed of execution and another person is frustrated with changing requirements. And then they're actually talking about different things, but in the same conversation without naming it. And then it's almost impossible to solve, right? Because if you don't name it, you're trying to reach different outcomes. So I think just really openly naming it and being like, hey, let's be clear. Let's just clarify, what are we not agreeing on? And that's one. And then a wrapper at the end would be that it's also, I think, absolutely okay to still come out of that session and be like, I see 5 apples, you see 6 apples. So therefore, this is the plan, right? And the plan may be, we have the founder in the room and the founder sees 5 apples. Therefore, we're going to move forward in that direction. We disagree. but we agree and commit. We kind of like disagree with this view, but actually we're still gonna all commit. We come out of that session positive without resentment towards each other. And just know that we just couldn't agree, but we still want to move forward. I think it's like very important to start the loop and then close the loop productively. And one bit that I think I'm finding difficult, and I think a lot of people who care deeply about their work find difficult, is to actually not get so invested that then you're in it so deep that it's really hard to be objective and take a step back. So just maybe reminding yourself of having a peer or colleague, someone who can kind of like pull you out a little bit in these conversations and be like, hey, have I gone too deep? Like, is it not worth it? If you can't get out, just getting that sense check, I think that's also helpful.
I feel like they're very, very wise words that are true for me, my role now and my role more in data. Obviously, I'm not a product leader, I'm a data leader, but hey, we're very close people. And the thing that I think is true in what Lisette and Maria are saying is like, in those moments of frustration, retain that open mind and continue to ask the questions, like understanding why someone has a bias and what that is very explicitly. Maybe use the word assumption rather than bias, because bias, some people get a bit funny about that word. But like really understanding what someone's assumption is so useful. But in those moments of conflict, often you shut down to like, they're wrong. I know what they're saying and I know I'm right. And so like continuing to be able to use your energy to ask the question, to understand why they are coming from that perspective and why they see, I don't know how many apples we have now, 5, 6, however many, is really valuable, rather than just as Lisette and Maria saying, like, falling back into kind of a negative or kind of overbearing state.
The amount of apples is now irrelevant. We're not even talking about the apples. Sara, obviously working in the chaos of early stage, speed is really important, and so is data. So how do you use data to win over skeptical stakeholders without slowing everything down? Have you got any tips on how you can do that?
Sure. I think it depends on the size of the business and where you are in that startup to scale up phase, right? But based on my experience in my past few roles, it's about balancing between like, what are the fundamental behaviors that we need to understand about the customer in a relatively deep way that might take a few weeks to get the data on, that are going to set us up for really kind of driving growth, like engagement, monetization, and retention would be the obvious big 3 things in the types of businesses I've worked at. Really understanding what's going on, what does it look like, what are the behaviors? And then outside of those, like once you've picked your fundamentals, which are slower to deliver, but are still talking weeks, not months, then just being clear on like the signal, like the other questions that happen week to week, day to day, often when you're in a trading environment and like in a commercial environment, get enough that the data is true, but it's more about signal than like a perfect narrative and story. And so trying to find the balance between those 2 things and find the right people in experimentation and insight that like are okay with that level of imperfection. So I think it's the kind of, you do need to understand the fundamentals. They may not be perfect insight analysis, but then you do also need just the signals along the way to keep things running.
And Maria, coming over to you, obviously as a CPO, as I'm sure that you've been on the other side of that too, where, potentially the path isn't clear, you don't have all of the data. What is there anything which makes you trust or like back a decision, say like from a product leader on their judgment? Like what is it that would make you kind of back someone if they didn't have all of the data?
I actually think that data sometimes, and Sara, forgive me, I think data sometimes is overvalued. And what I mean by that is, I think it's really important to ask yourself, if I had that data, would it change my decision or not? Because if it would not change my decision, then it's kind of pointless to get the data and it doesn't really matter. And I think there's some decisions that you need to make, or we need to make as a senior team, we need to make as product leaders or data leaders. Sometimes we just need to make decisions for a reason other than them just being data-led. And I would really look at what kind of decision are we making, and do we actually need, how much data do we need? And if it is a decision that I genuinely deem risky, let's say we want to change how we want to change a major part of our product, or we want to change onboarding completely, something that could have a big business impact or business model, I don't know, prices. in that case, I would want to see what are the riskiest questions that the team or the person have identified, and how are they going to de-risk these riskiest questions. And I think there I would look less for the data and stat sig, etc. But I would even look for, is there a clear path? Is there a clear structured path that I can understand and I believe in? Do I genuinely think that these are the riskiest questions that we need to be addressing first? And really coach the teams to find the easiest and quickest way to be able to get some indicative directional learning without being hindered by, like, I'm looking for perfect data, therefore I'm going to be running this for a very long time, therefore I need a research team and blah, 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 blah. So it's kind of understanding if it's a truly risky decision, let's understand what are the biggest risk points. How can we de-risk them to get comfortable enough? 1, 2, if a decision is actually, if having data would not change our decision, let's not even get stuck on that. Let's just move forward. And I think 3, in situations where, okay, it might be good to have some data, but actually decision is not very risky. Like we're talking about iteration of, I'm going to give a boring example, iteration of a page on the website or in the app. Then I would probably say, hey, like, let's just get it out and test it and find the lightest way to test it and let the customer or, the market actually tell us whether we're right or we're wrong, because we can be debating until the end of time whether it's right to make the button pink or black or orange. But actually it kind of doesn't matter. And last thing I would say is, I think, especially in product leadership, it's quite challenging. I think it's always important to remember that there's always this tension of where do you lean into intuition and you say, okay, let's just do it, we're going to do this, versus saying, actually, we need to research, like we need to understand it better before making a decision. And I think that's probably like the biggest part of, I would say, my job and jobs of other people similar to me in my roles, is to see, like, where does that decision sit on the spectrum? Therefore, what do we need to do next?
I definitely agree with all of that. And I think particularly for the bigger bets, the riskier bets, like breaking them down into those like sort of componentized pieces of risk and tackling them, I think is really a strong way to go. And what I've found helpful, particularly when maybe managing a stakeholder that just sees the whole thing as like a massive risk and can't really crack through that, is this concept of like a learning roadmap, and really just laying it out. So like, this is our plan for like execution, and we see the biggest risk is going to be around adoption, for example, and we're going to de-risk that in the next 3 weeks, and we're going to get to a decision point in a few weeks' time because we realize enough people will have been going through the platform to test whether it's going to work. And if we can't get past that, then we will either course correct, depending on what we learn, or can it. I think is a really helpful way of getting people to say, like, okay, we've got a plan to make sure that we can keep moving forward, and have like instances and milestones where we can actually say, stop, keep going, change direction.
Yeah, I think to build on that, I love like experiment your way into it when it's the right thing that you need to prove out. And I also agree with Maria on sometimes just do the thing, just see how it does if it's low risk. I think the trap happens though when someone tries to convince themselves that they can just launch the thing because they want speed and they don't want to experiment. And then after the fact, they can work out whether it worked. And there's sometimes this like weird trap you fall into in that experimentation learning space where you let yourself convince that you can do some post-analysis to prove whether or not it did. And you can't really, because there are a bunch of other things going on at the time. And so like we have to keep ourselves honest that when we're like, no, we're just going to bias for speed, we're just going to get it out, that like we won't then be able to work out whether it was incremental or not. Like it's the word I use most hours of the day. So like just like keep each other honest and founders honest and whoever, so that you don't then fall into that trap a few weeks down the line.
So, obviously it can be exhausting in early stages, but I feel like everyone is in early stages. What leadership habits have helped you thrive in that constant change?
I think those are the kind of classic ones that you would hear, which are things like lead with the data or explain the why, which I think are very kind of consistent. It doesn't have to be specific to a leadership role. It's just kind of a product mindset. I think what's often undervalued is actually sometimes the soft skills required in leadership. So my personal experience is that EQ is kind of like a multiplier of all of the other leadership skills. And it determines whether the team stays motivated, even when things are kind of feeling chaotic or kind of things are changing. Okay, the way I like to picture this, and I love like an analogy, is I kind of view a great leader as someone who's like a hurricane vase. There's the big glass vases that you put a candle in so that the wind can't blow out the flame. Like as leaders, we're not the flame, the team is. So I think from my point of view, it's the job of a leader to protect the flame from the wind. So that could be stress, shifting priorities, external noise. And I think making sure that you celebrate the wins that you are having very loudly and making sure that it's really clear to the team that where the wins are happening. Share lessons from failures constructively, because I think failures are often really, I view them as very valuable. If we didn't succeed with something, what have we learned from that? And I think at the same time, you're building a psychological safety within the team that helps motivate, and it actually improves velocity, improves reduce. That's one thing, the EQ within the team itself. And then sort of a network EQ, or that building a network, which Maria kind of touched on earlier. It's building like those genuine relationships with the peers and the stakeholders to hold you accountable, or to kind of feel comfortable saying, you were a little bit short in that meeting, or can I run something by you? Like building that network of people in the same way that you would in your kind of your personal life, sort of almost like a coalition at work, so that when things get really tough, those sort of behind the scenes relationships actually can help you move mountains quietly. So move things quite material, quite quietly, without lots of noise. So I'd say yes, lead with the data, protect the flame, protect the team, and build the network internally. And I think those habits keep you kind of thriving in change.
I would say, I think first of all, I think early stages not for everyone. So for example, when we recruit for roles at Beauty Pie, when I recruited for startup scale-up roles in the past, I try to be very explicit in interviews to say, hey, this is actually what you should be expecting from the role. Think long and hard whether you're comfortable with it, because it's totally fine not to be. And I think I've seen instances where someone would have come in, like they're amazing, very strong product person, and actually they just don't like it. They don't enjoy it. They don't like shifting priorities. They don't like ambiguity. They want clarity and enjoy that more of optimization space than, kind of going 0 to 1, 0 to 2. So I think first and foremost, it's setting these expectations and just being very clear. And the other thing I would say is it's important to be able to find joy in what you do. And for me, it's linked to learning. I think it's very much like looking back and thinking, how much have I learned? Just taking a personal stock of how much have you learned? What experience have you gained? How is it pushing you forward? Just doing that little retrospective with yourself, I find it helpful because it puts things in perspective. Even when things are difficult, you're thinking, wow, but actually I've learned this. Or, we've been able to try that, which would not be possible in another environment. And last thing I'm going to mention specifically, I would say for product. And I think for data, it applies actually for pretty much all functions that apply in early stage companies. I think you in reality have a lot more noise, but also a lot more opportunity to make an impact and really influence big strategic business decisions, right? And it's also something that if you're a person who enjoys doing it, it's almost like, this is the reward, but the price for it is going to be that it's not very straightforward and it's a bit messy. And you just have to accept it. And it's fine not to accept it, but I think probably most of us on the call do accept it or have accepted it. Yeah, that's my view.
A lot of that resonates with me as well. I think the finding space, particularly to kind of step back and just pause and be like, what are we doing? Why are we all here again? And just reminding ourselves of that, and then also seeing the progress that we're making, I think is super important. And I think particularly in early stage, like leadership, your job a lot of the time is to keep running towards like the next biggest problem. And you can get sucked up in it. It can also be exciting and fun to do. But I think just making sure that you create a space to reflect on how far you've come in the last weeks, months, years, etc. is really important. And finding rituals that you can share with the team to do that, I think enables everyone to stay motivated through those tougher days and weeks. Maybe one concrete one that I think has worked really well for us and somehow seems to be scaling with the company size too is every Friday we have a sort of 30-minute meeting where everyone in the whole company presents one thing that they've done that week, which has kind of pushed Una of our company forward. And I don't know how it scales with number of people, but it seems to somehow. And it's really helpful. And I think people find it, really motivating and also really interesting to see like how other people across the business are also pushing forward in their like respective work streams.
Yeah, they're all really good things. Sometimes it's hard to remember to do that when things are chaotic. But I think the theme that like strings it together is about making sure you provide the space for yourself to have that self-reflection. And in that self-reflection, like, yeah, you can think about what's not working well or what's hard, but also about like what is working and how far things have come, and how you have to do that self-check-in, that self-coaching, self-soothing almost. And like there are moments when I get more stressed maybe, and I have to work out like what is going on in my brain. Why am I feeling so uncomfortable? Why am I scared? Why am I doing it anyway? And like as soon as I realize I'm getting into that like negative state, I kind of try and talk myself out of it silently in my mind. That's because I've been able to have lots of coaching in the past. It's kind of helped me teach that. It sounds like everyone here has been on that train before, so it kind of works.
Yeah, and I mean, from me, I think everything that you've all said there is really relevant as well. Like being a solo founder and running my own business, I think that especially what you said around, reflecting on how far you've come, like sometimes the learnings that you've had. I always find that it's really good to like reset and just around like what was good, say 3 months ago. Now you could be past that, and then what's good now? Like, and actually just being comfortable with, I suppose, being able to reinvent what you're doing over and over and over again. Especially when you're at super early stages, it feels like that happens like frequently. Just get to that good now. Like, what's better? What's good again? And just kind of resetting on that. So we had some really brilliant questions from the audience. Some of these I've tried not to cross them over with what we've already discussed, but typically we've always gone off on a little bit of tangent, so we might have covered some of them. So if we have, that's fine. Just give us a bit of a recap on them. But I think there's some good questions in here to talk through. So the first being, how quickly should you be taking decisions when you're a startup? So a very broad question, but any of you have any advice in terms of like how you make decisions and the speed around them?
I think it's a little bit like asking, when should you be getting married? I don't know. It's like, it's individual, right? It depends on the situation. And I think for a startup, it's again very important. We talked about risky decisions versus non-risky decisions. I think that plays a big part. But generally, I think if I had to generalize, I would say startup, one of the biggest thing that gives startup an edge over bigger companies is speed, right? It's speed, and I think it's probably being brave enough to try something, maybe even sometimes something more reckless than, a bigger competitor or a bigger company would do. So I think it's like super, super important to maintain that speed and to encourage people to lead with speed and do things with speed. I think if you're earlier stage and you're not speedy, you're probably not going to be there for a very long time. Because then, there are going to be bigger companies that are faster. They have more resources. Sorry, they're not as fast, but they have more resources. And there are going to be other people who are maybe don't have as many resources, but they're scrappy and they just move really, really quick.
Yeah, it's almost an impossible question to answer. But other than most of the time, try to do it faster. I think there's more instances of companies startups moving too slowly and not pivoting fast enough and not learning quick enough than there are the other way around. So it's not that means just charge around and make tons of decisions without anything, but clearly try to speed up that process where you can most of the time.
Dominic, I think you also touched on this earlier as well a little bit, which is the decision-making process should be much faster for a two-way door decision than a one-way door decision that you can't come back from. And I think it's about being able to identify the risks, and then being confident and having enough confidence in the team that they can execute. But yeah, a two-way door decision should be much faster than a one-way, in theory, if you're going to be general about it.
We've answered a very broad question, I think, with some specifics there. So that's good. The second one is, how do you convince leadership that their great short-term idea might actually hurt long-term goals?
Run it as an experiment so that you can find out.
The third question is, how would you hire well for a role you aren't an expert in? So a little bit away from topic, but I think really interesting. So especially, as a leader in early stage.
I actually think that the most important thing about hiring generally, not just for early stage, is hiring people with the right mindset. Because a lot of the times, if somebody has the right mindset, unless we're talking about, very specific technical roles that require in-depth knowledge and they need to get going from day one, and you don't have anyone else in the team who's capable of doing it, that's separate, right? And I think when I work with founders and I see that they want to hire someone maybe very technical and they're not technical themselves, I'm not technical enough to help them, I always recommend to just find someone or pull someone from the network who is technical enough. And actually, whether you pay them, whether you ask them to do you a favor, it doesn't matter, but you can sort out and find that person and ask them to do it. I think quite often what I see startups do is that they ask their technical investors to do it, or they ask, friends from portfolio companies or like other companies to do it. So let's put kind of like the technical or the very specialist skills interviews aside. But I think for anything else, including product, I know that product, I don't want to undermine product as a skill set. I think there are a lot of valuable qualities, but a lot of them can be taught and a lot of them can be taught pretty quickly. So I would say the most important thing I'd be looking for is mindset. And it's, how flexible people are in their mindset, how ambitious they are. Do they want to be a part of the team? Do they want to really build something that they can be proud of, and how they feel about how important it is for them versus, are they there to just be there, 9 to 5 and nothing wrong with 9 to 5? Are they just there to kind of tick the box and move on to the next thing? Or are they really curious, interested, passionate, and have the right mindset to move the company forward? That's the most important thing I would look for.
Couldn't agree more. I think my specialisms are hiring within product design and engineering, but my partners, I've had on several occasions them work with me as a recruiter rather than a specialist recruiter in a different area of the business, because of the understanding that I have around the culture, around the type of people, around the mindset which they're looking for. So I definitely think that, like you said, when it's technical roles, obviously you have to lean into the understanding, but what generally does and doesn't work when I look at like hiring is around people being a culture mismatch or their mindset. Perfect. Burning the roadmap can be an opportunity to reboot and clear tech debt. Would you handle that differently?
I'm trying to understand. So we literally are burning the roadmap. So we are coming from, we have nothing to do now. If we have nothing to do right now, then I would probably let the engineers work out some things to do while I spend more time working out what to do. If it's a question more about how to handle tech debt in a company that's growing fast, which is always a tricky trade-off, my view is that tech debt should be owned by the engineering team, but clearly you have a strong discussion about what is prioritized and what's not, in the same way that I would hope that the engineering team is challenging product decisions. Now, it's ultimately them to own that decision, but if you're all swimming from like the same goals, then they should be able to thrash it out and come to some alignment around what's worked and what's not.
I sometimes say it, actually quite often say it when people challenge us on some of the decisions that we make that create tech debt. I always say that if you're in early stage and if you don't move fast enough, then actually it doesn't matter. Maybe it's not going to matter in a couple of years if you had tech debt or not, because the company is not going to exist anymore. It's a little bit of of course you have to make that trade-off, and I think you have to have good relationship with your engineering peers. For them to feel like they can come to you and be like, hey, like here we're really crossing the line. We should not be making this decision. And maybe setting that expectation up front, saying, hey, I'm going to push us to move fast because I'm trying to get X, Y, Z. If you feel like it's really completely kind of stupid one-way door decision, to what Lisette was saying earlier, and it's going to really prohibit growth in the future, let me know. Otherwise, like, can we just agree that we want to move fast? And I think having that agreement, that alignment, and like them being able to come to you and say, hey, like here, actually, we need to do something different. For me, that's enough. I don't think that's one. And then second, I also always question when people in early stages talk a lot about technical debt, because actually, if you've just started building quite recently, like how can you even have that much technical debt? Like, how do you build in a way that you create so much debt, right? Like, I think it's also an important question to ask as a product leader. Don't just take it on face value and be like, oh yeah, tech debt. Okay, let's spend a couple of sprints cleaning it. But challenging people back and be like, okay, like where does it come from exactly? Do you really need to do it? Like, how did it happen in the first place, and how can we get better in the future? Lisette?
I think one last thing I'd say is maybe it's not the term of technical debt, but it's like how when you do have things prioritized in the roadmap. So focusing more on the latter half of that question, which is handling technical debt. when you do have things prioritized, are there items on the roadmap that can involve some level of cleanup at the same time without extending the actual scope of the work significantly? So a really good example is, making changes to something that will speed up development time 3-4x in the future and it only costs us an extra 2 days. That seems like a very valuable trade-off to kind of discuss. But that again relies on engineering owning that and having a really strong relationship with your engineering counterparts to actually be able to have those discussions and make those decisions.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to close off the questions now because we've come to time, but there's a couple more which we can always answer outside of the podcast. I just wanted to thank you all so much for joining, not just on the podcast, at the meetup. If you were at the meetup, I hope this brought some of those conversations back to life. And if you're listening and you didn't get a chance to attend, then hopefully this gives you a bit of insight into what our meetups are like, and you'll have to come along to the next one. Thanks so much for listening to the Crave Connection In Product podcast. We're a community-first recruitment business supporting scaling companies to grow digital product teams. Our work and this podcast are all about being in product, in partnership, and in community. If you'd like to get more involved, join our Slack community where you'll get first access to our bi-monthly in-product meetups. You can also catch more episodes of Crave Connection in Product on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Amazon Music. And of course, follow In Product on LinkedIn to stay connected with me, AD, and the wider community. Thanks again for tuning in. See you next time.